January 23, 1943. Guadalcanal. The dawn burns red above Iron Bottom Sound. A formation of Japanese Aichi D-3A dive bombers descends through broken clouds, their engines growling like wasps. Below, Henderson Field lies silent, a thin strip of coral and mud carved from jungle, glistening with morning rain. Bombs fall. The ground erupts. Hangars vanish. Craters bloom across the runway, swallowing the airfield in smoke and dust. The pilots pull away, watching with grim satisfaction. They believe the job is done, the enemy's lifeline cut. Hours later, as the sun drifts westward, reconnaissance planes pass again. What they see defies belief. The same runway, once torn and cratered, now smooth and glinting in sunlight. American fighters taxi, lift, and climb into the sky like nothing happened. From the clouds above, disbelief turns to dread. How could an airfield rise from its own ashes in a single afternoon? The answer would echo across the Pacific. A story not of firepower, but of hammer strikes, steel plates, and unstoppable will. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had entered a brutal rhythm of destruction and renewal. Each island was a world unto itself, a speck of coral, jungle, and rock upon which empires collided. Japan's early lightning victories had carried its banners across half the Pacific, from Wake to the Philippines. Yet, beneath the surface of triumph, a quiet truth was emerging. The Imperial Navy had awakened an enemy whose strength was measured not in territory, but in endurance. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the island became the first true test of that endurance. The prize was Henderson Field, a half-finished airstrip whose control determined the fate of the Solomon Islands. For months, the Japanese and Americans traded blows in one of the most vicious seesaw battles of the war. A contest not only of courage, but of logistics. Japanese naval aviators viewed the airfield as the key to everything. If they could crater the runway, no American planes could rise. If no planes could rise, the fragile foothold on Guadalcanal would fall. Dozens of raids followed, each bringing waves of dive bombers and high-altitude attacks. Craters opened like wounds, hangars burned, fuel drums burst in orange fire. To the pilots above, it looked final. But what they could not see, through smoke and distance, was the swarm of activity that erupted the moment they turned homeward. Men of the U.S. Navy construction battalions, the Seabees, and Marine engineers poured onto the runways with shovels, graders, and bulldozers that growled through the night. The sound of hammering and roaring engines became the island's heartbeat. This was America's new weapon: speed of repair. In the Pacific, where every island was isolated, every runway bombed daily, the difference between defeat and survival lay in hours. The Japanese sought annihilation from the air. The Americans countered with resurrection from the ground. To understand why this mattered, one must look beyond the coral and palm trees. The United States had mobilized an industrial power unseen in human history. From the factories of Detroit to the steel mills of Pittsburgh, a flow of machinery and prefabricated materials streamed across oceans. Among the most vital were the Marston mats, portable steel planks punched with holes, interlocking like armor plates. They could transform swampy ground into a functioning airfield overnight, or seal bomb craters before the next sunrise. For Japan's pilots, raised in an empire that revered craftsmanship and endurance, this speed defied comprehension. They came from a nation that built ships and aircraft with precision, but by hand, where each engine was a masterpiece of care. Against them stood an enemy whose genius was not in artistry, but in repetition. America had learned to turn industry itself into a weapon. The cultural difference was profound. Japanese military doctrine emphasized decisive battle, the climactic strike that would crush morale and halt production. But the American war machine was designed to absorb blows and continue moving. Every destroyed runway was simply another problem to solve, another process to repeat. The hammer and bulldozer were as essential as the rifle. At Guadalcanal, and later on islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, this cycle repeated endlessly. Bombardment, repair, bombardment again. The Japanese saw destruction. The Americans saw maintenance. Even when the nights brought heavy rain and the days brought heat thick enough to blister steel, the repairs never stopped. The Seabees worked through malaria, sniper fire, and exhaustion, often with enemy shells landing just beyond the tree line. In Washington, military planners were learning that logistics was not a supporting role. It was the war itself. Admiral Chester Nimitz once remarked that the fighting power of a fleet rests upon the construction battalions behind it. That truth was written on the runways of the South Pacific. By late 1943, American engineers could rebuild a bombed-out airstrip within 12 hours. Entire bases could move forward with each invasion wave, reassembling themselves like a living organism. Every hour saved meant more sorties, more supply drops, and greater pressure on an overstretched Japanese empire. From above, it looked like magic. Runways reborn overnight, aircraft swarming at dawn. But beneath that illusion was the grinding labor of men who carried no rifles, yet turned the tide of war. And so, when Japanese pilots looked down upon the smoking wreckage of Henderson Field and imagined victory, they were seeing only the surface. Beneath it, America's industrial heartbeat had already begun to pound again. That heartbeat, the rhythm of hammers striking steel, would echo from Guadalcanal all the way to Okinawa. The story of America's instant airfields begins not with soldiers, but with builders, the men of the U.S. Navy construction battalions, known simply as the Seabees. Formed in March 1942, their insignia was a cartoon bee clutching a hammer, wrench, and machine gun, a symbol of labor and defense. Their motto, "We build, we fight," embodied a new kind of warfare, one where the tools of peace became weapons of war. The Pacific was a nightmare of geography. Thousands of islands stretched across an ocean larger than all the world's land combined. Each new advance required runways, ports, fuel depots, and barracks. But every patch of coral or volcanic ash had to be transformed by hand and machine. For the Seabees, every beachhead meant starting civilization from nothing. They were not ordinary construction workers. Many were miners, welders, dockhands, and engineers drafted from American industry. Their average age was 37, older than the typical Marine, and their discipline came from a lifetime of labor. When they landed on islands under fire, they carried rifles on their backs and bulldozers in their ships. Their enemy was not just the Japanese, but time. At Guadalcanal, the Seabees inherited an airstrip that was half-built, half-destroyed, and entirely essential. Working under bombardment, they filled craters with crushed coral and steel matting, guided by the dull orange glow of burning oil drums. The airfield was attacked almost daily, yet it never stayed down. Within hours of every strike, American bombers and fighters would rise again, a message to the enemy that destruction would always be temporary. Behind this resilience lay an industrial miracle. By 1943, the U.S. had mobilized a supply network capable of delivering prefabricated airfield components across the Pacific at astonishing speed. The key innovation was the Marston mat, officially pierced steel planking, PSP. Manufactured by the Inland Steel Company, these metal panels were light enough to be flown in or carried by ship, yet strong enough to support heavy bombers. Each mat was 3 feet wide and 15 feet long, punched with circular holes for grip and cooling. They locked together like puzzle pieces, forming an interlaced surface that could be laid directly atop sand, coral, or crushed lava. Where the Japanese saw chaos and cratered ruin, the Americans saw a puzzle to be reassembled. One naval engineer later wrote, "Every bomb hole was simply another hole to fill." That was the philosophy of the Seabees. Relentless practicality. They used whatever was at hand: coral, scrap metal, broken matting, even wrecked vehicles. Their genius was adaptability. In Japanese war reports, pilots described the phenomenon with growing frustration. Reconnaissance, photographs of supposedly destroyed airfields revealed fresh repair lines, new matting, and even extended runways. At Rabaul, Truk, and the Marshall Islands, they began to call the phenomenon phantom fields, airstrips that refused to die. This defiance was not accidental. It was strategic doctrine. American planners had learned from the disasters of early 1942, Wake Island, the Philippines, and Java, that immobile defenses were death traps. From then on, every invasion force included naval engineers who could carve a new base out of wilderness. Their arrival meant permanence. The day the Seabees landed, an island was no longer a battlefield. It was an outpost. Meanwhile, Japan's logistical reality was the mirror opposite. Their empire stretched thin across vast distances with few replacement materials. Pilots and sailors fought valiantly. But once a base was bombed, rebuilding took weeks or months. They lacked both the manpower and the machinery to restore infrastructure quickly. Even Japan's best airfields, like those in Rabaul or Formosa, suffered from shortages of cement and fuel. To the Japanese pilot, seeing an American runway operational mere hours after destruction was more than a tactical problem. It was a psychological one. It shattered the illusion of decisive victory. Each raid, no matter how devastating, felt futile when the same airfield greeted them the next morning with new aircraft lined up. That mental erosion was part of America's broader strategy. The U.S. war machine was built not just to win battles, but to wear down belief. Every repaired runway, every rebuilt pier was a message of abundance, proof that the democratic world could rebuild faster than tyranny could destroy. Even the sound of it carried symbolism. Across the Pacific, the clang of hammers and the growl of bulldozers became as constant as gunfire. It was the music of democracy's endurance. Each strike a reminder that collective effort could outlast even the fiercest assault. By 1944, these mobile construction forces operated like clockwork. Entire airstrips could be built in a day, complete with control towers, fuel lines, and anti-aircraft positions. On Tinian Island, the Seabees constructed the largest airbase in the world, Northfield, capable of launching the B-29 Superfortress bombers that would later deliver the war's final blows. This was the foundation for the shock that Japanese pilots felt in the final years of the war. They had entered the conflict believing technology and spirit would triumph. What they encountered instead was a machine powered by cooperation, invention, and industrial rhythm. A nation where even destruction became a process. And as the war rolled toward the Marianas and Okinawa, this rhythm only intensified. Each island fell faster, each runway rose sooner. The hammer had become America's quiet weapon, and its sound would soon echo in the skies above Japan itself. At the heart of every self-repairing runway were men who refused to stop. The Seabees, Marines, and Army engineers were not soldiers of glory, but of grit. They arrived at shattered airfields still smoldering from bombing runs, faces blackened with soot, hands raw from shovels and coral dust. Their battlefield was not the sky, but the ground itself. At Henderson Field, the smell of burned fuel mixed with the salt of sweat and sea wind. The air was thick with heat and fear. Yet amid the chaos, bulldozers roared back to life within minutes of the last explosion. Men guided the machines by instinct, filling craters with crushed coral and debris, while others hammered Marston mats into place. There was no pause, No retreat. A Marine correspondent wrote that the night had its own thunder, the sound of hammers and steel, echoing long after the guns went silent. That rhythm, steady, human, enduring, became the unseen heartbeat of victory. They worked under strafing runs and artillery fire, often without sleep. Some were killed while repairing runways. Their bodies later carried off silently so the work could continue. Yet for every man lost, another stepped forward. Their sense of purpose was clear. Every hour of repair meant another squadron could take off. Another mission could strike back. What kept them moving was not orders, but conviction. A belief that rebuilding was as noble as fighting. In the Pacific, survival was collective, and the hammer in one man's hand was as vital as the rifle in another's. In the Pacific, time was the most valuable resource. Every island base operated under the same brutal equation. Whoever could get planes airborne faster won. Japanese strategy leaned on destruction. A successful air raid could paralyze an island for days, grounding aircraft and halting supply drops. It was a method that had worked during their early offensives in 1941 and 1942, but by mid-war, that logic no longer held. American runways didn't stay broken. They came back to life faster than reconnaissance teams could report their destruction. Each rebuilt runway effectively nullified the entire cost of an enemy raid. A Japanese pilot might risk his life, spend hours navigating through flak and cloud cover, drop his payload with precision, only for the result to be erased within the day. That realization was devastating. For the Americans, this speed of repair became part of their tactical rhythm. During the Solomon Islands campaign, CB units were attached directly to air operations. As soon as the last Japanese bomber left the sky, bulldozers moved in. Fighter pilots often reported that they could still see smoke rising from repair zones as they took off for counterattacks. This rapid recovery cycle had a cascading effect. Japanese pilots, once confident in their capacity to suppress airfields, began to face constant resistance. Every repaired runway meant more American sorties and more pressure on Japanese supply lines. By 1944, the Americans had turned runway repair into a doctrine of logistical warfare. Each base acted as both spearhead and fortress, expanding American reach deeper into enemy territory. Even small coral islands, once dismissed as useless, became stepping stones for the advance toward Japan. From Tarawa to Saipan, the pattern repeated. Devastation by morning, reconstruction by dusk, full-flight operations by dawn. Japan's empire, built on the illusion of permanent victory, found itself facing an opponent that refused to remain destroyed. Behind this cycle of endurance and speed was an evolving arsenal of technology, tools of resurrection forged from American industry. The bulldozer, once a symbol of domestic progress, became the hero of the Pacific. The Caterpillar D8 and D9 machines could move entire landscapes, clearing palm trees, coral, and wreckage with brutal efficiency. On some islands, they pushed wrecked aircraft into the sea to make space for the next runway extension. The Marston mat, mass-produced by the millions, was the material embodiment of American problem-solving. One man could lay a sheet in seconds. A team could cover a football field in an hour. Entire stockpiles were shipped ahead of invasions, floating on barges ready for the next island. These mats weren't just metal. They were mobility incarnate. Even airfield design itself evolved into a science. Engineers learned to shape runways along wind patterns, to divert tropical rain, and to anchor them with local materials. On volcanic islands like Iwo Jima, they used pulverized lava rock. On coral atolls, they crushed limestone. Every island offered its own ingredients, and the Seabees adapted like chemists of terrain. Each advance turned the Pacific into a vast laboratory of applied engineering. The logistical systems feeding this machinery stretched from the west coast of America to the front lines. a chain of supply that no empire had ever matched. And yet, the technology alone wasn't enough. What made it work was synchronization, the ability to connect effort, purpose, and material in perfect rhythm. When a Japanese pilot looked down at a bombed runway and saw it functioning hours later, he wasn't witnessing a miracle. He was seeing a system at work, a human machine that extended from the individual hammer to the industrial furnace in Detroit. That connection between the worker's hand and the nation's heart was the invisible secret of the self-repairing airfields. The hammer continued to strike, hour after hour, island after island. Each blow was a statement. Destruction could no longer claim permanence. And yet, the deeper truth of that sound would only be revealed when the war reached its final stages, when the skies over Okinawa and Japan itself trembled under both bombs and hammers, and even the enemy began to sense that time itself was no longer on their side. From the cockpits of Japanese dive bombers, destruction had always been final. When their bombs struck, they expected silence to follow, the stillness of victory. In China, in the Philippines, and across the Dutch East Indies, a single successful raid could cripple an airbase for days. It was a rhythm the Imperial Japanese Navy had come to rely on. Strike, retreat, and let absence speak for triumph. But over Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and later Saipan, that rhythm broke after each raid. Reconnaissance aircraft returned to photograph the damage. The results bewildered the intelligence officers at Rabaul and Truk. Runways that had been blackened and cratered were operational again by the time film was developed. One Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, later described his astonishment at seeing planes rise from fields we had burned to ash the day before. To the pilots, it felt supernatural. They had risked everything, threading through flak, machine gun fire, and American fighters, only to discover that their sacrifices vanished into futility. Each repaired runway became a symbol of America's bottomless endurance. In Tokyo's war offices, disbelief hardened into frustration. Reports from the front used phrases like inexplicably restored and enemy airfields reappear overnight. They suspected deception, perhaps dummy fields, or false photography. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. The Americans could rebuild faster than Japan could destroy. Every sortie became an echo of hopeless repetition. Bomb, burn, return, and watch the same field hum back to life. The effect was psychological erosion, an invisible weapon that no flak gun could stop. The contrast between Japan's and America's wartime philosophies was never more visible than in those airfields. For Japan, war was a test of spirit, of individual sacrifice, loyalty, and honor. The nation's warriors were taught that willpower could overcome material limits. From kamikaze pilots to engineers on remote islands, the imperial ethos celebrated endurance and purity of effort. To surrender or to depend on others was shameful. For America, the war was a test of organization, of coordination, cooperation, and shared strength. The Seabees' work embodied that ethos. Each hammer strike was not an act of personal valor, but a thread in a greater fabric of unity. Theirs was a democracy of labor, where the collective effort of many outlasted the heroism of one. This difference defined the Pacific War. Japan fought with extraordinary courage, but courage alone could not repair a runway. It could not mass-produce steel mats or send endless convoys of fuel and food. America's power came from its ability to channel millions of hands toward a single goal. To Japanese eyes, that seemed impersonal, almost mechanical. But to those on the ground, it was the essence of democracy, a system where every contribution mattered. The man with the hammer, the welder in a factory, the pilot above the sea, all were parts of one vast, beating heart. It was this moral contrast between the solitary warrior and the collective builder that shaped the war's outcome. The Japanese pilot, soaring toward a target, represented a single noble will. The Americans below, hammering steel into a runway, represented a civilization at work. As the war advanced across the Pacific, the sound of hammers and engines became more than background noise. It became symbolic. In letters home, American soldiers described the constant pounding of the Seabees, comparing it to a heartbeat that never stopped. Journalists embedded with the engineers wrote of a rhythm in the night, a metallic cadence echoing across jungle and sand. It was a sound both ordinary and profound, a reminder that America's greatest weapon was not the bomb or the plane, but the will to rebuild. To the Japanese, that sound carried dread. Pilots returning from failed raids spoke of hearing the clang of metal through the smoke, like defiance itself echoing from the ground. It became, in their minds, the voice of an enemy that would not stay broken. That hammer, simple, human, unglamorous, came to represent something larger than war. It was the physical manifestation of American abundance and democratic resilience. Every strike on steel was a declaration. Destruction is temporary. Freedom is permanent. Even after the war, in the ruins of Japan's own cities, survivors would remember that sound. For them, it became part of a larger truth, that the strength of a nation lay not in how fiercely it fought, but in how swiftly it rebuilt. In the Pacific, the clash of ideologies was not only fought in the skies or seas, but also in the invisible realm of belief. Japan's imperial ideology had been forged in centuries of hierarchy and tradition. It prized purity of purpose and saw the state as an extension of divine order. The idea that war could be won through mass production and teamwork seemed spiritually hollow, until it became undeniable. The Americans, by contrast, fought with the faith that democracy itself could organize chaos. Their system rewarded coordination, rewarded invention, and turned flexibility into a creed. The self-repairing runway was its purest expression, a living system that embodied renewal, equality, and adaptation. Each rebuilt strip of coral and steel was not just a feat of engineering, it was an ideological victory. It said to the world, "We can take your best shot, and we will still rise tomorrow." That message would reverberate through the rest of the war. By the time the American fleet neared Okinawa, the Japanese High Command knew what it meant. They were fighting a nation that had mastered not just destruction, but recovery. And so, as the Pacific tightened its grip around the Japanese homeland, the image of the self-healing runway lingered in the minds of the pilots who once believed in decisive victory. It was more than a tactical frustration. It was the sound of an empire realizing that its enemy's strength came not from dominance, but from endurance. That realization would reach its breaking point in the final campaigns, when Japan learned that even in the face of annihilation, the hammer never stopped. Guadalcanal, August 1942. The island is a cauldron. Heat, insects, exhaustion, and the ever-present smell of burning aviation fuel. For months, the Americans have clung to a thin, muddy strip of coral called Henderson Field, their only link to the outside world. Every day it is bombed, shelled, and strafed. Every night, engineers crawl across it in the darkness, patching holes by lantern light. On August 20th, the first wave of Japanese bombers approaches from Rabaul, escorted by sleek Zeros. The defenders' radar, primitive and sputtering, barely has time to sound the alarm. Sirens wail. Marines dive for cover. Within minutes, the airfield erupts under a rain of fragmentation bombs. Dust and fire swallow the landscape. Craters gape open across the runway, some 10 feet deep. Fuel drums explode like artillery. A P-400 fighter is lifted into the air and hurled aside like paper. From above, The Japanese pilots see chaos. Black smoke coiling upward, flames licking the edges of the jungle. It looks absolute. They pull away, satisfied. Their mission report will read, "Airfield rendered unusable." But as dusk falls, the jungle stirs. Bulldozers roar to life, their engines coughing through the smoke. Men with shovels and wheelbarrows emerge from foxholes. Marines, Seabees, and even wounded infantrymen gather in the red haze, guided by the flicker of oil drum fires. The order is simple. The runway must live by morning. The sound begins again. The clang of hammers, the grind of gears, the rhythmic shout of labor. Coral crushed and shoveled into holes, then packed tight under the weight of machines. Men work in shifts that never end. Some fall asleep standing, their hands still gripping tools. Others die under renewed shelling and are quietly replaced. By midnight, the first section of the runway gleams pale under the moonlight, patched with Marston mats flown in from Espiritu Santo. The coral dust rises like fog as the men hammer each steel plate into place. At dawn, Japanese scouts circle overhead. Below them, the runway, the same one they had cratered hours before, stretches unbroken. The first American Wildcat fighters taxi forward, engines snarling, and rise into the sky. The scouts are stunned. They turn back, radios crackling. Runway operational. Planes airborne. In Rabaul's operations room, disbelief spreads like a contagion. The airfield that should have been lifeless is reborn before the ink of the previous report has dried. Commanders order another strike. Hours later, the bombers return. Another wave of fire and thunder. The same process repeats. Runway shattered, smoke rising, destruction assured. And yet by the next sunrise, aircraft once again take off from the same coral strip. It is a cycle of defiance. Marine pilots begin calling Henderson the airfield that refuses to die. To the Japanese, it becomes the ghost base. Every bomb, every raid, every sacrifice of their own airmen seems swallowed by an enemy that simply will not yield. For the men on the ground, the phenomenon feels almost spiritual. "You could set your watch by it," one CB later recalled. The planes came at noon, and by midnight, we had it fixed. Always. The toll is immense. Men labor half-naked in sweltering heat, skin blistered, eyes stung by sweat and smoke. Malaria gnaws at their bodies. Shells burst in the distance. Yet the rhythm continues. Hammer, lift, fill, lay, hammer again. Each impact on the Marston mats rings like defiance against the sky. By September, Japanese pilots stop believing their own after-action reports. They begin to question whether the Americans possess a secret reserve of runways hidden beneath the earth. It was as if the island itself healed, one Japanese diary recorded. "We struck again and again, but the wounds vanished by morning." In truth, it was not the island that healed. It was human determination shaped by machinery and logistics. The U.S. Navy construction battalions had turned a primitive jungle clearing into a living organism that could regenerate faster than it could be destroyed. Every rebuilt section of Henderson Field carried a cost in blood and exhaustion, but it also carried a message, one that rose with every departing aircraft. The Japanese pilots could no longer measure their victories in destruction. Their bombs had lost permanence. By October, Henderson Field was more than an airstrip. It was a symbol, a pulse, a declaration that America's reach in the Pacific was irreversible. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received intelligence summaries describing the repeated failure to silence the field, he reportedly muttered, "Then we have lost the island." And in that moment, the myth of unstoppable Japanese air power began to fade. For the first time in the war, the Empire of Japan faced an enemy whose resilience made destruction meaningless. The hammering did not stop at Guadalcanal. It grew louder, stronger, spreading like the sound of progress across the Pacific. Every island conquered became another heartbeat in a chain of resurrection. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Tinian, Iwo Jima. The next great test of that rhythm would come in 1945 at Okinawa, where the Japanese would unleash everything they had left and still watch the airfields rise again. Okinawa, April 1945. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War has begun. More than 500,000 Allied troops swarm toward the island, supported by an armada of 2,300 ships. The Japanese High Command knows that this is their final stand, the last line before the homeland. For Japan's airmen, this is also the last chance to turn the tide. In a desperate campaign known as Operation Kikusui, hundreds of kamikaze pilots are ordered to throw themselves at the invasion fleet and the airfields that sustain it. The hope is simple: cripple the runways, ground the planes, and slow the advance. The targets are the newly seized Kadena and Yontan airfields, still fresh scars carved into Okinawa's earth. The Japanese command expects chaos to follow the first strikes. They expect the same paralysis they once inflicted on Pearl Harbor and Clark Field. Instead, what follows is déjà vu, the same impossible rhythm that began at Guadalcanal. On April 6th, the first great wave comes. Over 350 kamikazes diving through clouds of flak and tracer fire. The sky burns. Bombs and bodies crash into the runways. Craters bloom across the fields, flames licking at fuel dumps and parked aircraft. American engineers take shelter in foxholes as debris rains down. When the smoke clears, Kadena Airfield is a wasteland of craters and wreckage. Commanders on the ground radio grim assessments. Runway destroyed. Major damage. But within the hour, the roar of bulldozers returns. The Seabees, now veterans of 1,000 rebuilds, crawl from their shelters and begin again. Trucks pour crushed coral and gravel into the holes. Cranes drag aside wrecked planes. Welding torches flare against the dusk. A Japanese reconnaissance flight circles overhead the next morning. From the cockpit, the pilot sees something impossible. Both runways, the same ones they had obliterated, are already repaired. Fighters line up for takeoff. His voice trembles as he radios the report. Enemy airfields, operational. In Tokyo, disbelief borders on despair. The commanders order renewed strikes. Waves upon waves of kamikaze sorties. Each raid tears at the island, filling the air with fire and screams. And yet, as one Japanese survivor later wrote, even after death rained upon them, the Americans built again. The speed of repair is staggering. By May 1945, the 1902nd Engineer Aviation Battalion can fill a crater, lay steel matting, and reopen a runway in less than 4 hours. Bulldozers operate night and day. Crushed coral glows white under searchlights as repair crews labor through the smoke. The hammering, that same sound that once echoed through Guadalcanal's jungles, now reverberates across Okinawa's hillsides. To the Japanese pilots, it is a nightmare given form. They dive again and again, trying to silence it, only to die within earshot of its relentless rhythm. For the Americans, each repaired runway becomes a monument to persistence. Kadena grows into a massive complex, launching B-29 bombers directly toward Japan. Yontan supports endless waves of supply flights and fighter escorts. The faster the Japanese destroy, the faster the Americans rebuild. It becomes a cruel arithmetic. For every day of bombing, only hours of downtime follow. This cycle breaks more than just machines. It breaks morale. One captured Japanese officer later admitted, "We could destroy their airfields, but not their spirit." We realized then that we were fighting against something greater than soldiers. That something was industrial democracy at its most relentless. Behind every bulldozer and hammer stood the weight of an entire civilization. Millions of workers in America's factories, mines, and shipyards. Every sheet of Marston mat laid in Okinawa had once been stamped in a steel mill in Pennsylvania. Every gallon of fuel poured into bulldozers had crossed the Pacific on Liberty ships built by the hands of ordinary citizens. It was this chain, invisible but unbreakable, that Japan could not match. Their war effort, rooted in scarcity and sacrifice, was collapsing under the weight of an enemy that seemed limitless. By June, the kamikaze raids slowed. Many of the young pilots, barely trained, faced an unbearable truth. They could die destroying an airfield, but it would be alive again before their names were even recorded. It was like fighting the sea, one said after the war. You strike the waves, but they always return. When Okinawa finally fell in July 1945, the American engineers stood amid miles of gleaming runways, enough to launch the coming assaults on Japan's mainland. The last surviving Japanese reconnaissance photographs show something haunting. Runways stretching like veins across the island, perfectly restored, perfectly alive. Those photographs marked the end of an illusion. The illusion that destruction alone could win a war. From that point on, Japan's high command understood that no matter how many planes they sacrificed, they could not stop what was coming. The hammer had beaten the sword. And in the faint metallic echoes rising from Okinawa's fields, the empire could already hear its fate. The sound of rebuilding, rolling ever closer to its shores. The hammer's rhythm had now crossed the Pacific. Soon it would merge with a new sound. The low hum of bombers departing from those repaired runways, bound for the skies above Japan. From the clang of hammers to the roar of engines, America's will had found its voice. When the smoke cleared over Okinawa in mid-1945, the airfields stood unbroken. Kadena and Yontan had endured the most relentless air assault in the Pacific, yet by the campaign's end, they were launching more aircraft than at any point before. The Japanese had thrown everything they possessed: precision raids, suicide squadrons, night attacks. And still the runways gleamed under the summer sun, whole and living. For the Allies, the lesson was unmistakable. Resilience was strategy. The ability to rebuild faster than the enemy could destroy became the defining weapon of the Pacific War's closing act. From these airfields, American bombers streamed northward toward Kyushu, Shikoku, and Honshu, carrying with them the full weight of industrial warfare. Japan's commanders studied the reports with disbelief. Reconnaissance photos arriving from Okinawa and the Marianas showed bases that multiplied, not diminished, under attack. In official communiques, words like unprecedented and unexplainable appeared again and again. The concept of permanent damage, once the foundation of Japanese tactical planning, had collapsed. This breakdown of logic rippled upward through the entire imperial system. Morale among pilots and ground crews eroded. Many began to question the purpose of missions that yielded no measurable result. As the months dragged on, losses mounted without visible effect. The sense of futility became pervasive. For America, however, the opposite was true. Each reconstruction was a small resurrection, a tangible reminder of progress. The CB's efficiency turned war into a continuous cycle of renewal. Their speed became legendary. Airfields repaired in 6 hours. Bridges rebuilt overnight. Piers restored before the tide returned. Their unofficial motto, "The difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer," was no exaggeration. Reports sent to Admiral Nimitz from Okinawa read like chronicles of industrial miracles. One engineering log described how, after a 500-pound bomb carved a 20-foot crater in Kadena's main strip, bulldozers and fill teams had it flight-ready in 90 minutes. Another recorded that Yontan's southern runway, hit by 8 kamikazes in a single day, resumed operations within 5 hours. Such feats gave the Americans not only operational advantage, but psychological dominance. Pilots took off with the knowledge that their bases would always stand behind them. Air crews spoke of a kind of faith, not spiritual, but mechanical, that their runways would be waiting when they returned. For the Japanese, this certainty was devastating. War had become a contest of rhythm, and they were falling behind. Even when their strikes found targets, the damage evaporated by morning. Each mission consumed scarce fuel and irreplaceable lives for no strategic gain. The Imperial Navy's once mighty air wings, reduced to desperate kamikaze units, faced an enemy that had turned reconstruction into invincibility. The symbolism did not escape notice. American correspondents on Okinawa wrote that the hammer has replaced the sword. Photographs circulated in newspapers back home showing Seabees working beside still-burning wreckage, smiles faintly visible through the smoke. To a public weary of war, these images carried a quiet reassurance. The nation's strength lay not in the act of destruction, but in its power to rebuild. Strategically, the implications were enormous. The rebuilt runways of the Pacific formed a chain of permanence, a network stretching from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Each link allowed aircraft to fly farther, carry more, and strike deeper into Japan's shrinking perimeter. By the summer of 1945, the U.S. could project force directly onto the home islands without pause. Japan, in contrast, faced a logistical vacuum. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. Replacement aircraft existed only on paper. The empire that had once expanded by seizing airfields now found itself unable even to maintain its own. And so, in the final months before surrender, the outcome was no longer decided by bombs or bullets, but by an idea that endurance itself could be mechanized. The Americans had proven that victory did not belong to the side that destroyed the most, but to the side that rebuilt the fastest. Beneath every runway repaired, beneath every hammer stroke, lay the sound of inevitability. By August 1945, the war that began with surprise and fire ended with inevitability and dust. Japan's empire had been broken, not by one battle or one weapon, but by a relentless process that turned destruction into routine. The self-repairing runways had become the living metaphor of that process. No matter how fierce the blow, America rebuilt and rebuilt again, until resistance itself ran out of breath. When B-29 bombers lifted off from the restored airfields of Tinian, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, their engines echoed that same hammer rhythm that had once driven the Seabees through the night. The runways that had risen from the ashes of Guadalcanal now launched, aircraft carrying the final expression of industrial war. The high-tech atomic bombs that fell upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the end was both shocking and strangely familiar. The weapons had changed, but the pattern was the same: annihilation met by reconstruction. Cities turned to rubble would, within a generation, rise again with the same quiet resilience that had once baffled their own airmen in the skies of Guadalcanal. After the surrender, American occupation forces surveyed the damage. Entire prefectures lay in ruins, yet amid the silence, the sound of tools returned. First cautious, then confident. The very engineers who had perfected the art of wartime rebuilding now helped Japan rebuild itself. Bulldozers once used to fill bomb craters now cleared debris for schools. Cranes that lifted Marston mats now lifted steel beams for new factories. The cycle of repair had become a philosophy of rebirth. In Tokyo, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur, spoke of a resurrection of the Japanese nation through work. He had seen firsthand how the rhythm of industry could transform chaos into order. Under American guidance, Japan would soon adopt that rhythm. turning its wartime discipline into post-war productivity. The transformation was profound. The same industrial methods that had shocked Japanese pilots, mass coordination, prefabrication, modular logistics, became the foundation of Japan's economic miracle. In a sense, the empire had learned its final lesson from the very enemy it once sought to destroy. For the Americans, the memory of the Pacific remained etched not only in graves, but in achievement. The Seabees returned home, older, scarred, yet proud of a legacy measured not in victories, but in construction. They had built more than 400 airfields, 300 bases, and countless roads and harbors across 300 islands, an empire of endurance. In their reunions years later, veterans recalled not the roar of battle, but the steady clang of hammers under a tropical sky. "That was the sound of our war," one said. "We didn't win by killing. We won by building faster than they could destroy." And so, the moral symmetry of the war came full circle. Japan had entered the conflict seeking to prove the power of will over material. It ended by witnessing the triumph of cooperation over isolation and of resilience over despair. When the last Japanese pilot surrendered, the skies fell silent. But beneath that silence was the same lesson written in every repaired runway: that freedom's strength lies in the capacity to rebuild. Years later, visitors to Okinawa could still trace the outlines of Kadena's wartime airstrips. Jets thundered across the same runways once patched by exhausted men with shovels. The steel mats had long been replaced by concrete, but the symbolism remained. Each takeoff was an echo of the same defiance that once rose against the odds, a testament to the idea that endurance is the truest form of power. And in the quiet, after the engines fade, one can almost hear it still, the faint rhythm of hammers ringing through time, the sound that rebuilt the Pacific, the sound that ended an empire, the sound of democracy enduring. The Pacific War ended not only with surrender, but with revelation. Beneath the thunder of guns and the glare of firestorms, a quieter truth had emerged: that endurance, not destruction, defines civilization. In every hammer strike that echoed across the islands, democracy found its rhythm. It was not glamorous nor heroic in the traditional sense. There were no flags waving over those half-built runways, no speeches carved into stone. Only men working through exhaustion, guided by light from burning fuel drums, turning chaos into order and ruin into purpose. That rhythm, metallic, steady, human, became the true anthem of the Pacific. It told the world that a society built on shared labor and trust could rebuild itself endlessly. Where totalitarian empires sought purity, control, and obedience, democracy sought continuity, the simple promise that no act of destruction would ever be final. The Japanese pilots who once looked down and saw those self-repairing runways were witnessing more than engineering. They were seeing an idea made visible: that freedom's greatest strength lies not in its weapons, but in its capacity to recover. Decades later, as Japan rose from its own ashes, that same rhythm returned in new form. The sound of factories, trains, and shipyards rebuilding a peaceful nation. The hammer that once built war airfields now built bridges, cars, and homes. In that transformation lay the ultimate victory. Destruction had taught creation how to endure. And so, the story of the Pacific is not merely one of conquest, but of renewal. Every repaired runway, every rebuilt city, every sound of construction in the aftermath of chaos, all carry the same heartbeat that once echoed through the jungles of Guadalcanal and the coral fields of Okinawa. The hammer still rings, if you listen closely, not in defiance now, but in remembrance. A sound that says, freedom rebuilds. A sound that says, resilience never dies. The war ended long ago, but the rhythm endures. The quiet, steadfast music of a world that learns, heals, and rises again.